Throughout history, humanity has sought to understand its origin and its relationship with the divine through sacred texts. The Bible, one of the most studied and interpreted books in the world, contains linguistic and narrative enigmas that, when observed carefully, reveal a cosmology much more complex than we are traditionally taught. Among these mysteries, there is a particularly intriguing one that resides in the first pages of the Holy Book: the word Elohim, a plural term used to describe an entity that is supposed to be unique. When we delve into the original Hebrew scriptures, we realize that the creation narrative is not as simple as it seems at first glance. References to divine counsel, multiple celestial beings, and dialogues between powerful entities appear in several passages of the Bible, challenging the strict monotheistic view that predominates in contemporary religious thought. What would happen to our understanding of spirituality and human history itself if we discovered that, in the beginning, there wasn't just one solitary creator, but a council of heavenly beings collaborating in the great work of creation? The origin of the word Elohim goes back to the earliest biblical texts, appearing in the very first verse of Genesis. In the beginning, Elohim created the heavens and the earth. This Hebrew term is used hundreds of times in the sacred scriptures to refer to God, which in itself would not be so surprising, were it not for a crucial grammatical detail that most modern readers are unaware of. In Hebrew, the ending im indicates plural, similar to the s in English. Thus, Elohim literally means gods, a plurality of divine entities. This creates a fascinating linguistic paradox. The very texts that laid the foundations for monotheism use a plural term to refer to the supreme deity. Wouldn't that in itself be an indication of something more complex behind the traditional narrative? Conservative scholars often explain this anomaly as a majestic plural, a grammatical form used to denote greatness and power, similar to the royal we used by monarchs. This explanation, while convenient for keeping the monotheistic view intact, doesn't fully answer the question when we analyze the full context of the ancient writings. Deeper linguistic analysis reveals that the use of Elohim in the Bible is inconsistent with the explanation of the majestic plural. In several passages, as we will see later, the term is used in conjunction with plural verbs and pronouns, suggesting an intentionality in the communication of multiple entities, and not just a figure of speech to magnify a single being. Dr. Michael Heiser, a scholar of Semitic languages at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, has devoted much of his academic career to investigating this linguistic phenomenon, proposing that the term Elohim indicates a celestial hierarchy, a divine assembly with a supreme leader. His studies show consistent patterns in the Hebrew texts that point to this interpretation. In esoteric traditions, this divine plurality is seen as evidence of the existence of multiple levels of consciousness and entities that operate in the creation and maintenance of the universe. Jewish Kabbalists interpret Elohim as manifestations or emanations of the absolute divinity, while Christian Gnostics saw these references as confirmation of their cosmology, which included multiple divine beings or eons. The Sumerian civilization, which preceded the Hebrews by millennia, already had records of divine councils and multiple gods working together. Is it possible that the early biblical writers, familiar with these older traditions, incorporated elements of this knowledge into their own religious texts? When we compare the oldest biblical manuscripts with their later translations, we notice a gradual effort to soften these pluralistic references. For example, the Septuagint, the first translation from Hebrew into Greek, already begins to adapt the text to a more strictly monotheistic vision, showing a possible theological evolution or even a deliberate attempt to reinterpret older writings. The Dead Sea Scrolls, discovered at Qumran between 947 and 956, provided new perspectives on the original texts. These documents, which date from the 3rd century before Christ to the 1st after Christ, preserve older versions of biblical texts where references to multiple divine beings appear with greater clarity and frequency than in later canonical versions. Wouldn't it be surprising to discover that the concept of a single supreme God surrounded by a council of lesser divine beings made more sense to the ancient Hebrews than the idea of an absolutely solitary creator? After all, this model would reflect human social organization itself: a king surrounded by his court, a priest surrounded by his acolytes, hierarchical structures that were familiar to ancient man. Let us make man in our image, after our likeness. This phrase, found in Genesis chapter 1, verse 26, constitutes one of the most intriguing and least explained passages in the sacred scriptures. Here, the Creator is not only referred to by the plural Elohim, but also uses plural verbs and pronouns. Let us make our. This divine dialogue clearly suggests a conversation between multiple beings, a collective deliberation on the creation of humanity. Traditional interpretations offer three explanations for this phenomenon: God speaking to himself in self-deliberation, God addressing the Trinity, a later Christian interpretation, or God communicating with the angels. Each of these explanations presents conceptual problems when examined in the light of the original historical and linguistic context of the texts. The self-deliberation theory contradicts the very patterns of the Hebrew language, where such a construction would be extremely unusual. Furthermore, at no other point in the narrative does God speak to himself in this way, making this case a strange exception if we accept such an interpretation. Why would the author use this unique construction only at this crucial moment? The Trinitarian explanation, although popular among Christian theologians, represents an obvious historical anachronism. The concept of the Trinity emerged centuries after Genesis was written, and was only formalized at the Council of Nicaea in 3500 BC. The original writers of Genesis, who were part of the Jewish tradition of the second millennium before Christ, could not have referred to a theological concept that did not yet exist. The idea of God talking to angels is also inconsistent, because according to traditional theology itself, angels did not take part in the act of creation, they were created themselves. Furthermore, the text states that man was created in our image and likeness. If God were talking to angels, this would imply that humans were created in the image of both God and angels, a notion that contradicts orthodox interpretations. Archaeologists have discovered that in the ancient cultures of Mesopotamia, contemporary to the earliest biblical writings, it was common to believe in divine councils where a chief god consulted other celestial beings before making important decisions. The Sumerian tablets of Enuma Elish, for example, show Marduk discussing with other gods before creating humanity, a remarkable parallel with the text of Genesis. In modern academic biblical studies, there is growing recognition that the early Hebrew texts reflect a more complex cosmology than strict monotheism. Dr. Mark Smith, professor of biblical studies at New York University, demonstrates in his work The Biblical Origins of Israelite Monotheism how the concept of a single God gradually evolved from a more pluralistic view of the divine. The cultural context of the ancient Near East provides valuable clues on how to interpret these passages. All the civilizations surrounding Israel, Egyptians, Sumerians, Babylonians, Canaanites, had pantheons with divine hierarchies. It would be naive to think that the Hebrew writers were not influenced by these cosmological concepts that permeated the entire region for millennia. Jewish apocalyptic literature, such as the Book of Enoch, considered canonical by the Ethiopian Church, but apocryphal for most denominations, provides detailed descriptions of heavenly assemblies made up of multiple divine entities. These works, although not included in the modern biblical canon, were widely read and respected in the Jewish communities of the Second Temple period. When we examine the divine dialogues in Genesis with an open mind, free of doctrinal presuppositions, what emerges is the image of a heavenly council deliberating over creation. The question that remains is, who are these other beings who were apparently present at the moment of humanity's creation, collaborating with the Supreme Creator in this fundamental act? The pluralism of Genesis chapter 1, verse 26 is not an isolated case. In Genesis chapter 3, verse 22, after Adam and Eve ate the forbidden fruit, we read, "Then the Lord God said, Behold, the man has become like one of us, knowing good and evil." Again, the text suggests a plurality of divine beings, reinforcing the impression of a heavenly council actively participating in the primordial events of humanity. The 82nd Psalm opens with an extraordinary scene rarely discussed in conventional religious circles. God stands in the divine congregation. In the midst of the gods he judges. This verse presents a shocking image for those brought up in the strict monotheistic tradition, God presiding over an assembly of other beings explicitly called gods, Elohim, in the original. We are looking at a direct glimpse of the divine council in full operation. This psalm continues with God rebuking these gods for failing in their responsibility to uphold justice. How long will you judge unjustly and favor the wicked? This passage suggests that these beings had delegated authority over earthly affairs, including systems of justice. Who were these entities with such responsibility for the administration of human affairs? In 1 Kings chapter 22, verses 19 to 23, the prophet Micaiah describes a vision of the heavenly throne. "I saw the Lord sitting on his throne, and all the host of heaven standing by him on his right hand and on his left." This is followed by a dialogue between God and these spiritual beings about how to lead King Ahab into battle. This passage reveals not only the existence of the council, but its active participation in decisions affecting human historical events. The book of Job offers another glimpse of this heavenly court. In Job chapter 1, verse 6, we read, "And the day came when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came among them." Here, the sons of God, Bnei Elohim in Hebrew, appear in a kind of divine audience, suggesting periodic meetings of this heavenly council, where human affairs were discussed. In the book of Daniel, chapter 4, we find references to watchers and holy ones who come down from heaven to decree destinies, heavenly entities who take an active part in overseeing earthly affairs. Daniel chapter 7, verses 9 to 10 describes an impressive scene from the divine throne. Thousands of thousands served him, and myriads of myriads stood before him. This heavenly army does not seem to be made up only of passive servants, but of active participants in the divine court. When we examine the book of Deuteronomy chapter 32, verses 8 to 9 in its oldest versions, such as those found in the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Septuagint, and not in the modern translations which have been subtly altered, we find a revealing passage. When the Most High distributed the nations, when he divided the sons of Adam from one another, he set the terms of the peoples according to the number of the sons of God. This text suggests that different nations were assigned to different members of the divine council. Isaiah chapter 6 presents a vision of the heavenly throne where beings called seraphim surround the Lord. The intriguing detail appears in verse 8, when God asks, "Whom shall I send, and who will go for us?" Again, we have the contrast between the singular, "I will send," and the plural, "for us," indicating a collaborative decision between multiple divine entities, not just a figure of speech. In Ezekiel, chapters 1 and 10, the prophet describes complex visions of heavenly beings with multiple faces and wheels within wheels, the famous cherubim and Ophanim. These are not mere poetic descriptions, but attempts to articulate visions of a hierarchical and multidimensional spiritual reality that defies our limited understanding. The Revelation of John continues this tradition of revealing complex heavenly structures, with descriptions of 24 elders sitting on thrones around the main divine throne, Revelation chapter 4, verse 4. Indicating a heavenly governmental structure with different levels of authority and function. These elders seem to be more than just messenger angels. They actively participate in the heavenly government. The existence of this divine council does not necessarily contradict monotheism, but redefines it. A supreme God, creator of everything, who rules through a hierarchy of subordinate celestial beings. This vision, known as inclusive monotheism or hierarchical monotheism, is much closer to the original understanding of the biblical writers than the simplified monotheism that prevails in modern religious thought. Who exactly are these beings referred to as sons of God or gods in the sacred texts? The original Hebrew terminology offers us significant clues. The term Bnei Elohim, sons of God, appears in several ancient texts, always referring to heavenly beings of a divine or semi-divine nature, never to humans. This distinction is crucial if we are to understand the true nature of the divine council. The most controversial appearance of these sons of God occurs in Genesis chapter 6, verses 1 to 4, where we read that they took unto themselves the daughters of men, and begot mighty sons called Nephilim or giants. This enigmatic passage suggests that these celestial beings possessed physical form, or could assume it, and were able to interact directly with the material plane, even generating hybrid offspring with humans. The Book of Enoch, although considered apocryphal by most modern Judeo-Christian traditions, provides the most detailed account of these events. According to Enoch, 200 of these celestial beings, led by Simjaza and Azazel, descended on Mount Hermon, made a pact with each other, and taught humans forbidden knowledge about metallurgy, cosmetics, sorcery, and astronomy. This advanced knowledge would have accelerated the development of human civilization, but also introduced corruption and violence. This narrative of the Watchers, as they are called in Enoch, has remarkable parallels with legends from other cultures about gods who came down to earth and interacted with humans. The Greek stories about demigods born from the union between gods and mortals, the Sumerian legends about the Anunnaki, and the Hindu myths about the Devas present surprisingly similar themes. Could it be that all these traditions are preserving fragmented memories of real events? The Qumran texts reveal that the Essene community, a Jewish sect from the Second Temple period, took these stories about celestial beings and their interaction with humanity very seriously. Several manuscripts found among the Dead Sea Scrolls contain elaborations on the story of the Watchers and its consequences for humanity, demonstrating that these narratives were not considered mere fables, but sacred history with profound theological implications. According to the ancient texts, these sons of God were not all the same, but organized into complex hierarchies. The Book of Enoch describes different orders of angels with specific functions. The seraphim, beings of light and fire close to the throne. The cherubim, guardians of the heavenly mysteries. The Ophanim, the wheels associated with divine movement. The dominions, virtues, powers, principalities, archangels and angels, each group with distinct responsibilities in cosmic administration. This hierarchy was partially preserved in later angelological traditions, both in Judaism and Christianity. Pseudo-Dionysius, a Neoplatonic philosopher from the 5th century after Christ, systematized these angelic orders in his work The Celestial Hierarchy, which became fundamental to the development of medieval angelology. However, his work already represents an attempt to domesticate and simplify much older and more complex traditions. What few realize is that some of these sons of God were designated as overseers or princes of specific nations. The Book of Daniel explicitly mentions the Prince of Persia and the Prince of Greece as powerful spiritual entities associated with these empires. Daniel chapter 10, verses 13 to 20. Michael is identified as one of the first princes and the special protector of Israel, suggesting a geopolitical distribution of authority among the members of the divine council. This idea of heavenly beings overseeing different regions and peoples explains much of the Old Testament language about foreign gods. When the prophets condemned the worship of Baal, Asherah, or Moloch, they were not necessarily denying the existence of these beings, but rejecting their worship by Israel, which should be faithful only to the supreme God. This would represent a henotheistic perspective, exclusive worship of one God without denying the existence of others, which later evolved into strict monotheism. The rebellion of part of these celestial beings against the supreme authority is a recurring theme in ancient scriptures and traditions. The story of Lucifer, interpreted from Isaiah chapter 14 and Ezekiel chapter 28, the revolt of the Watchers in Enoch, and various myths about celestial wars in other cultures, all point to a primordial schism in the divine council that would have profound consequences for cosmic and human history. Near Eastern archaeology has revolutionized our understanding of the historical and cultural context in which the Bible was written. Excavations in Ugarit, an ancient city-state in the territory of present-day Syria, have revealed texts that are surprisingly similar to the biblical narratives. The Ugaritic documents, which date back to the 14th century BC, describe a divine pantheon led by a god called El, cognate of Elohim, who presided over a council of 70 minor gods, called the Sons of El. This discovery is particularly significant because Ugarit shared linguistic and cultural roots with the ancient Israelites. The Ugaritic language is extremely close to Biblical Hebrew, allowing scholars to identify linguistic parallels that shed light on obscure terms in the scriptures. When the Bible uses Elohim and B'nai Ha-Elohim, it is employing terminology that would have been immediately recognizable to anyone familiar with the Canaanite cosmology of the time. Further east, in Mesopotamia, the Sumerians had already been describing a divine council called the Anunnaki, literally, those who came to earth from heaven, since the 3rd millennium before Christ. Led by An, the sky god, and later by Enlil, these beings were described as supervisors of human civilization, to whom different cities and functions were assigned. The parallels with the biblical divine council are obvious to any impartial scholar. Later Mesopotamian texts, such as the Epic of Gilgamesh and the Enuma Elish, preserve descriptions of divine assemblies where major cosmic decisions were made. In the Enuma Elish, for example, the gods meet to decide who will face Tiamat, the chaotic primordial goddess. These accounts of celestial councils deliberating on the fate of the cosmos anticipate similar narrative structures that we find in the Bible. In ancient Egypt, despite the apparent polytheism, there were complex hierarchical divine structures. The concept of the Ennead, a group of 9 primordial deities led by Adam or Ra, represented an attempt to organize the divine into levels of manifestation and authority. Texts such as the Book of the Dead reveal that even in Egypt there was the notion of a divine court where souls would be judged, another form of heavenly council. The Zoroastrian tradition of ancient Persia, which exerted a profound influence on Judaism during and after the Babylonian exile, presents Ahura Mazda surrounded by 6 Aim-Shah Spentas, beneficent immortals, divine entities who administer different aspects of creation. This hierarchical structure, with a supreme God surrounded by a council of lesser divine beings, shows remarkable conceptual similarities with the biblical divine council. In ancient Greece, Olympus was home to 12 main gods who formed a divine council presided over by Zeus. Plato, in his work Timaeus, presents the concept of the demiurge, a divine creator who shapes the universe with the assistance of lesser gods, to whom he delegates the task of creating mortal beings. This Greek philosophical vision of a cooperative divine hierarchy has remarkable parallels with biblical descriptions of creation. The indigenous cultures of the Americas, completely isolated from the traditions of the Middle East, independently developed similar concepts. The Mayans described a council of creator gods, the Bacabs, who held up the sky in the four corners of the world. The Incas recognized Viracocha as the supreme creator, but surrounded by minor deities with specific responsibilities for different aspects of nature and society. This universality of the concept of divine hierarchies and celestial councils across cultures with no contact with each other raises a fascinating question. Are we dealing with universal archetypes of the human psyche, as Carl Jung would suggest, or could these similarities indicate the fragmented perception of an objective spiritual reality that different cultures have captured in their own way? Even in more recent monotheistic traditions, traces of the concept of divine council persist in modified forms. In Islamic theology, Allah is surrounded by angels such as Gabriel, Jibril, Michael, Mikhail, and others who form a kind of heavenly court. In medieval Jewish Kabbalah, the 10 Sephiroth represent emanations or manifestations of divinity that administer different aspects of creation, a reinterpretation of the ancient concept of divine council in terms more acceptable to strict monotheism. The rediscovery of divine counsel in the sacred scriptures is not just an academic exercise in textual archaeology, but has profound implications for our contemporary spiritual understanding. If these ancient texts are really describing a more complex spiritual reality than the simple God versus angels dualism of popular theology, then our cosmology needs to be revisited and expanded. Aren't we neglecting whole dimensions of spiritual reality? Esoteric traditions have always kept alive the notion of complex cosmic hierarchies. The Christian Gnostics of the first centuries described elaborate systems of eons and archons, spiritual entities on different levels that influenced material reality. These traditions, although marginalized by orthodoxy, preserved aspects of the original cosmology that were gradually removed from the official interpretations of the scriptures. We should seriously consider the possibility that the simplification of spiritual cosmology was a deliberate choice for political and social reasons. A single absolute God, without intermediaries, justifies similar hierarchical power structures on earth: an absolute king, a divine emperor, and undisputed religious authority. The more complex and pluralistic cosmology of the original texts did not lend itself so easily to such political applications. Modern quantum physics has revealed a much more complex and interconnected fundamental reality than the Newtonian mechanistic model suggested. Concepts such as quantum entanglement, multiverses, and parallel dimensions open up space for a more sophisticated understanding of reality that, surprisingly, seems more compatible with ancient cosmologies than with the simplified view of the universe that has predominated in recent centuries. Some contemporary researchers, such as Graham Hancock, Robert Bauval, and Giorgio Tsoukalos, have proposed controversial interpretations of interventions by advanced beings in the development of early human civilization. Although their theories are often ridiculed by the academic establishment, it is remarkable how many of them find parallels in the ancient narratives about the sons of God and their interactions with primitive humanity. Are we rediscovering, through modern archaeology, memories of real events preserved in mythological form? Experiences of contact with non-human entities reported in various contexts, from religious visions to experiences with psychedelics or abduction phenomena, show recurring patterns that suggest the possibility of interaction with levels of reality normally inaccessible to ordinary consciousness. Could the variety of these experiences indicate contact with different categories of beings, similar to the hierarchies described in ancient texts? If we take the biblical descriptions of divine counsel seriously, we would have to reconsider our understanding of prayer and spiritual intercession. Instead of a simplistic model where each prayer is directly received by a single God, we would have a more complex system where different celestial entities could be involved in receiving and processing these communications, depending on their spheres of responsibility. A vision much closer to the practices of venerating saints in Catholicism or communicating with orixas in Afro-Brazilian religions. The apparent contradiction between monotheism and the existence of multiple divine beings can be resolved through the concept of emanation, The idea that the supreme divinity manifests itself on multiple levels and forms, maintaining its essential unity while operating through diverse expressions. This concept, present in Jewish Kabbalah, Islamic Sufism, and Christian Gnosticism, offers a conceptual bridge between philosophical monotheism and the textual evidence of the divine council. The cosmology of the divine council invites us to expand our conception of the divine beyond anthropomorphic limitations. If there are multiple levels of consciousness and being between the human and the absolutely divine, then our own spiritual evolution could involve ascending through these levels. Isn't this the real message behind Jesus' enigmatic statement, "You are gods," John chapter 10, verse 34, quoting Psalm 82? The rediscovery of the divine counsel in the scriptures does not diminish the greatness of the supreme creator, but amplifies it, revealing a cosmic project of far greater complexity and beauty than simplified interpretations have allowed us to see. As we contemplate this expanded cosmology, we are invited to reimagine our own position in the grand scheme of creation. Not as biological accidents in an indifferent universe, nor as servants of a solitary celestial monarch, but as participants in a great cosmic community that stretches across multiple levels of reality. We confront linguistic, archaeological, and conceptual evidence that points to a cosmology much richer and more complex than that generally presented in conventional religious interpretations. The word Elohim, the divine dialogues in the plural, the explicit descriptions of celestial assemblies, and the parallels with other ancient cultures converge on an inescapable conclusion. The original sacred texts describe a universe inhabited by multiple levels of divine beings organized hierarchically under the authority of a supreme creator. This rediscovery is not intended to challenge faith, but to deepen it, reconnecting us with the original understanding of the sacred writers who bequeathed these texts to us. Spiritual truth is always deeper and more complex than our simplified interpretations suggest, inviting us on a continuous journey of discovery and understanding. If you're interested in exploring more about spirituality, I've specially selected for you some videos full of profound insights and fascinating discoveries that you'll love. Just click on one of them. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel to continue this journey of self-discovery and spiritual learning. Your commitment to knowledge is the first step towards transforming your reality.